Please note, since the recording of this webinar, the list of applicable activity codes was modified to remove activity codes DP1, DP2, DP3, DP4, and DP5, and to clarify which phase awards are also applicable. Find the latest information about simplifying NIH's peer review framework at https://grants.nih.gov/policy/peer/simplifying-review/framework.htm.
All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about how NIH is simplifying the NIH peer review framework for most research project grants, starting with applications with due dates on or after January 25th, 2025. This webinar is the first of what will be a number of events that we have planned to help ensure that applicants, reviewers, and NIH staff understand the new framework. My name is Megan Columbus. I'm the Communications Director in NIH's Office of Extramural Research. I'll be your moderator. We're kicking off today's event with a video introduction from Dr. Mike Lauer, NIH Deputy Director for Extramural Research. And following that video, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Mark Caprara, one of the co-chairs of the implementation team for this initiative. After that, we'll bring on the other co-chairs on screen for a panel, and we have plenty of time that we can address questions. Please note that the chat feature we've turned off, and you should be using the Q&A feature for questions. We'll be answering as many as we can following this event. So now, let's go ahead and hear from Dr. Lauer.
Hello, I'm Mike Lauer. I'm the NIH Deputy Director for Extramural Research. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to be discussing the rollout and implementation of the NIH Simplified Review Framework, sometimes we call it SRF, for research project grants. And this is going to be implemented for applications coming in January 25th, 2025, and later. Now, I like to think of the NIH as being a learning organization. We are. And we have learned from many people. We have learned from peer reviewers, we've learned from staff, and we've learned from many of you who have responded to our calls for input, and we're very grateful to that, about ways in which we could improve peer review. Peer review obviously is a bedrock, it's a pillar of what we do. Every year we receive about 80,000 applications, and every single one of them undergoes some form of rigorous peer review. And that peer review obviously is critical in helping us make the best, well-informed funding decisions. So what have we learned? What have we learned from reviewers and from staff and from many of you is that there are ways in which we can improve peer review. We can make it less complicated, simplify it, focus more on the scientific and technical merit of proposals, as opposed to other items which are important, but which are probably more appropriate for the agency to deal with. And we can also mitigate problems related to reputational bias. And by doing these two things, by focusing and simplifying review so that the focus is on scientific and technical merit, and by taking steps to mitigate the problem of reputational bias, we can improve peer review, and that can help the agency be more successful in its mission. So my colleagues are going to work with you and explain with you exactly what we're going to be doing in order to implement this. Again, the implementation will be effective as of for applications coming in January 25th, 2025, and later. And I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank those of you who participated in our various groups and who responded to our RFI, because through that, this has helped our learning and helped make things better. So thank you very much, and I hope you find this event to be interesting, informative, and helpful.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for setting the stage for us so well. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Mark Caprara. Mark is a review branch chief at NIH's Center for Scientific Review. And as I mentioned previously, he is one of the chairs of the implementation team for this initiative. So go ahead and take it away, Mark. You're on mute.
Not professional enough. Thank you, Megan. I'm going to share my screen. And we'll get. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody who's attending today as we go over the Simplified review framework. So we'll start with an overview. So review of grant proposals to NIH goes through a two-stage process, the first of which is performed by scientists who volunteer their time to evaluate the scientific and technical merit of applications. Today, we'll introduce the Simplified Review Framework for research project grants that are expected to improve how peer reviewers evaluate these grants. These grants are called RPGs. They include the well-known R01 and R21s. And as Mike stated, this will go into effect for applications due for January 25th, 2025. For this webinar, we'll be including background on how and why this was developed, and then I'll introduce the framework. So as Mike pointed out in his introductory remarks, the framework has been developed with significant input from the extramural community. So over the years, NIH has received concerns regarding complexity of peer review. A formal request for community input was issued by a blog that was published in February of 2020. And we received over 400 comments and emails, and content analysis of these comments provided the foundational data for a working group that was formed to tackle these issues. So what were the issues with regards to review that needed to be addressed? So this slide shows that the issues fall into two broad categories, and some representative comments are shared. So first, the complexity of peer review criteria has grown over the years, including asking reviewers to comment on administrative and compliance issues. Comments mentioned that this detracts from reviewers' attention away from the critical primary role to evaluate scientific merit. We also received a lot of comments about reputational bias. And this was a concern whereby well-known places and people are given a pass, while others are treated with more scrutiny. The next step was the formation of a working group, including extramural scientists familiar with the peer review system and NIH staff. And they developed a set of formal recommendations to address these issues. And this report was completed in April of 2021. The recommendations were then discussed and refined somewhat by NIH working groups. And this went through a formal approval process that was completed about a year ago. We then reached out to the community again for their input versus a request for information and other outreach efforts between December of 2022 and early 2023. The analysis from these responses can be found in the link in this slide. We received 800 responses from individuals, societies, and institutions. And the big take-home message was that the majority of them were supportive. And this is likely a reflection of how much input the scientific community had in developing the framework. One recommendation that came up many times related to implementation was the call for developing strong training resources. And this is certainly a focus as we implement this framework. So what is the framework? So the goals of the framework are to enable peer reviewers to better focus on answering the key questions necessary to assess scientific and technical merit, mitigate the effects of reputational bias, and reduce reviewer burden. The next two slides show the four major aspects of the new framework, including the underlying rationale for them. So first, simplify and improve review by focusing reviewer attention on three main questions. Should it be done? Can it be done? And will it be done? And this was done by reorganizing the 5 core review criteria into 3 factors that align with these questions. So the importance of the research, should it be done? Rigor and feasibility, can it be done? And expertise and resources, will it be done? Next, modify the criterion definitions for investigator and environment to reduce reputational bias. This was done by having reviewers assess the adequacy of investigator expertise and institutional resources with respect to the work proposed as a binary choice, so appropriate or gaps identified. Third, simplify and strengthen the review criteria by using conceptual definitions rather than long lists of questions. Shifting away from extensive sets of complex questions encourages more thoughtful integration of concepts rather than yes, no, or checklist thinking. And finally, relieve reviewer burden by not requiring peer review of select additional considerations. So considerations not directly related to scientific merit shift to NIH staff administrative review. And the next few slides show these changes. So on the left, this is the current criteria as they're currently organized. Each receives a criterion score, and major score driving points are provided by the reviewer. On the right is the new framework. The criteria organized in 3 factors, as I mentioned before. Factor 1 is the importance of the research. This encompasses significance and innovation. This will receive a factor score and reviewer comments. Factor 2 is rigor and feasibility. This encompasses approach and also will include the inclusions for human subjects and clinical trial study timeline. Again, this will receive factor score and comments from the reviewers. And finally, there's reviewer factor 3, which is expertise and resources. This encompasses investigators and environment. This does not receive a score, but is evaluated as appropriate or gaps identified. And if there are gaps identified, reviewers will provide an explanation. Reviewers will still provide an overall impact score that reflects their overall judgment of scientific merit based on an integration of the evaluations for each of these factors, as well as additional review criteria, human subjects protections, vertebrate animals, and biohazards. As with existing score methods, reviewers will weigh these factors as they see fit when arriving at an overall impact score. This slide shows a couple of examples of how review definitions have been modified from complex questions into more conceptual definitions. These aren't the only definitions under Factor 1. I just chose 2 for simplicity, and the other factors have similar types of definitions. So it was felt that these definitions are clearer than the current questions, will help to focus reviewers. The guidance to the reviewers is more direct, and this should also lend to easier reviewer training. Finally, to reduce reviewer burden, most additional review considerations will be removed from first-level peer review and shift to the awarding institute or center. Currently, there's 5 additional review considerations that don't affect the overall score. In the simplified framework, reviewers will only have to review 2 out of the 5. It can be easier to visualize this framework in a familiar way, such as what your summary statement would look like in the new framework. And so this is shown in the next couple of slides for a standard R01. So all discussed proposals will get an impact score and percentile. It will also include a resume and summary of discussion that's prepared by the SRO. And then it'll be followed by 3 sets of critiques, each organized in the following way. Factor 1 and Factor 2, you'll see a score. The score will be displayed, followed by strengths and weaknesses, followed by an overall impact paragraph, and then Factor 1, strengths and weaknesses. Factor 2, again, strengths and weaknesses. And again, as I mentioned in this example, it will include inclusion plans for human subjects research, if appropriate. Factor 3 will be organized in this way. It'll either be it'll either have an appropriate selection, or if gaps were identified, it will include reviewer text to explain that. And then it'll be followed by protections for human subjects, vertebrate animals, biohazards, authentication, and budget and period of support. So what are the expectations and how will NIH monitor progress. So by simplifying, reducing burden, and addressing reputational bias, the expectation is that the quality of review improves. And what we mean by that is we'll have clear evaluations of the importance of the research, should it be done, the rigor and feasibility of the approach, can it be done, and the appropriateness of investigator environment, will it be done. So some of the measures that we actively pursue in evaluating peer review are going to be shown on the rest of the slide, and this will be used to evaluate the new framework. So SROs and leadership will continue to monitor critiques and meeting discussions, trends, positive or negative, will be discussed, and problems addressed promptly. We'll be monitoring and benchmarking scoring distributions against an existing extensive database. We collect reports of bias from reviewers and applicants and investigate and act upon them. This also gives us an opportunity to compare this data through different review rounds and years. We frequently survey reviewers and NIH staff regarding the perceived quality of review and review experience, and we'll be able to benchmark new surveys against previous survey data. And we will engage with the applicant community for feedback. Now, as I said, we expect peer review to improve, but attributing improvement to this initiative solely will be difficult. And the reason for that is NIH is committed, and for example, NIH is committed to addressing reputational bias on multiple fronts. You can go to this link here to see that. After implementation, if we see positive changes in the range of institutions or investigators that receive funding, for example, this will need to be taken in the context of these other complementary efforts. So what's happening between now and January 2025? We'll be making changes to our NIH peer review systems, developing training resources, and updating and publishing funding opportunities, because each funding announcement needs to have an updated version of a section on review. There'll be lots of training and outreach to socialize this change for reviewers, chairs, applicants, and staff. And then finally, we have a public-facing website for this initiative. This has a lot of information on it now, and we will continue to populate it as the implementation of this framework progresses. And with that, I thank you for your attention and echo Mike's thanks to members of the scientific community who contributed their thoughts and hard work in developing this framework.
Thank you for that super helpful overview, Mark. So now let's have our other chairs join us for a Q&A panel. Dr. Brian Hochshaw, who's Chief of the Scientific Review Branch at the National Eye Institute, and Dr. Lisa Steele, a Review Branch Chief at NIH's Center for Scientific Review. Now, many of you submitted questions when you registered for this event, and while many of those questions were likely answered by Mark's presentation, I thought we could go ahead and start with a few of those before moving on to those that we're receiving in real time. So, are there anticipated changes to the SF424 R&R application to reflect the changes in the review process?
So we don't anticipate any changes on how you need to prepare your application, but we also always encourage applicants to be aware of the review criteria and keep these in mind when you're crafting your application, since that's what is guiding reviewers.
Yeah, good advice. What about factors 3? How will that affect the overall score when it's being rated as sufficient or not?
So first, let's take a step back and just remember that the overall impact score is not an average of the criterion score or some complicated mathematical formula. It is the result of weighing the major strengths and weaknesses that have been identified in the review criteria to come up with that score. So there are elements that don't receive scores presently, like protection of human subjects, that still have ability to be factored into the overall impact. So even though factor 3 doesn't get a score, if it is a major score driving factor, it can be included. But, if it's not, then it doesn't affect the overall assessment.
Okay, so just to play off of that a little bit more, I see somebody just came in with a question. In factor 3, then if gaps are identified, how would that affect the success of the proposal?
And so that, just like any other, strengths or weaknesses in the review criteria identified by reviewers, it's up to the reviewer's discretion to decide if that weaknesses, or in this case, a gap, will actually affect the overall scientific merit of the application. And they will explain that in their overall impact paragraph, those major score driving issues.
Thank you for driving that home. Okay. So how will the simplified review framework improve the chances of funding of PIs from resource limited or research limited?
I can address that one. So as Mark pointed out in his presentation, one of the goals of the simplified review framework is to address reputational bias in peer review. So not only with the investigators, but also with the institutions. So we're doing this by changing the review of investigator and environment to it, and changing it from a detailed discussion with criterion scores and strengths and weaknesses to a binary assessment of appropriate or gaps identified. And this is in terms of the science I proposed. So we're hoping this will level the playing field. For example, when a research limited institution, if they have the resources needed for that application, they will be able to compete with a larger institution, which might have a wealth of resources that aren't related to it. We're hoping this will level the playing field when the focus is on factor 1 and factor 2. And NIH will be providing specific training to reviewers and chairs to really reinforce this point.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. I think this one's probably going back to Mark. I know we talked about the application forms themselves are not changing, but there's still a question regarding whether the application will change, whether it'll change the structure or the order of the assembled information that's seen by reviewers.
So, no, I mean, we've talked about doing that because that suggestion has come in before, and technically it's feasible but very difficult to do. So at this time, we're not going to do that. But I will note that what's interesting is that most research strategy sections are organized now. There's a section on significance, then innovation, and then the approach. And actually, this aligns quite nicely with how factor 1 and factor 2 are organized.
Great, thank you. Question related to masked review. Could you eliminate the name and institution of the PI to eliminate bias or make the review even more efficient and effective?
So this has also come up a lot throughout this process. So federal regulations require us to assess investigator, environment, and to assess, all 5 of the criteria as part of the review. So the best we could do would be a 2-stage review where the first part is masked, the second part isn't. They're actually doing that now. CSR is doing that with their transformative R01s. And they've also done this before with their CSR anonymization study. Hopefully a lot of you have heard about that. And 2 points. One, they found in both with the transformative R01s and then the anonymization study that about 20% of the reviewers can figure out, just from the research and approach, can figure out who the PI is. There's a small field, you recruit the expertise, they know the players, they know the research, so they can figure it out. And then secondly, NIH reviews about 80,000 applications a year. So logistically, to do a 2-stage review for everything would really be a burden on the community and the reviewers, and I think would affect the level of review. Well, we have thought about this throughout the process.
Right. There's some questions about other mechanisms. So we talked about this impacting most research project grants. There are some exceptions, like small business. But this question is about if small business, career development, and Ps are not, which are program projects, are not impacted by these changes. Will they stay with the same 5 standard review criteria, or will those undergo changes soon as well?
So I'm sorry, is it SPIRs, Ks, and Ps? At the moment, no, they're going to stay the same.
There are changes. Oh, sorry. There are changes coming for F, so stay tuned for those. But the other ones will stay the same.
Yeah, and those F changes will be different than what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I'd say just as a note to people that every funding announcement contains that section 5 that tells you the review criteria. So, even if you missed all of this, communications and all the notices, whenever you apply, look at that section 5 and you will see exactly what you will be evaluated on.
Absolutely. Following up on the master review, is there discussion on possible 2-stage reviews?
So that as I mentioned, those are being used as transformative R1s, but logistically for all 80,000 applications, that wouldn't be. It might be expanded a little bit, but logistically, we're already trying to condense the timeline between submission, review, and counsel. So adding another step would really kind of go against that whole movement.
So, a follow-up question about this overall impact score. It's not clear to me how providing an overall impact score reduces reputational bias when, in the end, the reviewer has the option to highly weight factor 3 in their overall score.
Well, I think that you have to remember that if it is a review criteria, the reviewers can use it to determine their overall impact score. So we can't eliminate that ever being a score driving factor, and it would be inappropriate to do so. It is an evaluation for these grants, and it should factor in according to the importance determined by a reviewer. But as Mark said, this isn't the only thing we're doing. To reduce reputational bias, we have a great training module that is currently being used and will soon be mandatory to alert reviewers about, the problems with reputational bias. SROs are reading these critiques and providing feedbacks, as well as being very attentive during the meeting. And reviewers themselves have noted that after the training, they felt more comfortable interrupting or asking questions themselves in the meeting. So it's everybody, together working on this issue. I think that will make real headway. This isn't going to be like a one-shot. It can totally prevent that.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, as Lisa said, there are a lot of things we have in place to address this, and it's not one reviewer who reviews the application and gives a final score. The whole panel votes, and we're hoping to really change the culture of the review meeting. And we're already starting to see that in some of the meetings where they've taken the training. Reviewers will point out, like, well, okay, we shouldn't give that much weight just because of their seniority, or that much weight because of the university. We should assess everything. So having a culture change, training not just reviewers, but chairs and also SROs to really address this.
Yeah, good answer. So we have more questions about this factor 3, right? So I'm going to combine a couple of these questions. One is, well, how will factor 3 be quantified? And I know we've already touched on these things, but if factor 1 and 2 are exceptional and 3 is not appropriate, how will that affect the score?
So again, it's not appropriate. It's if some gaps are there. So let's say, for example, you propose to do a wonderful structural study on a protein using NMR, and everything looks great. And then when it gets to the resources, you find out that you don't have access to an NMR machine, right? So can it be done that way? Obviously not. But those things are never that extreme, right? So sometimes you'll have gaps in expertise for a small part of the application. And the reviewer is just going to have to weigh that in terms of, well, is this project, if it should be done, can it be done, even without this expertise? And they'll just weigh those things.
And I do want to add that. Yeah, it's not absolute. And it's also, you may identify gaps, you may identify weaknesses, but the question is, are they addressable? If they're easily addressable gaps or, deficiencies, then reviewers may decide that it's easily addressable, so it doesn't really affect the score. So it's not just the presence of these concerns, but how are they addressable? Are they major?
Thank you. We have a question about when the exact language for the simplified review is coming out. And, before I throw anything to the panel, I just want to let people know that we did put out a guide notice that has the language there. If you do a search on NIH Simplified Review, you'll also find websites that detail our new Simplified Review framework. Certainly, we will be providing additional information for reviewers and our scientific review officers and other things, and those will be coming at a time that's closer to the time they'll actually need it to do what they need to do. Does anybody on the panel want to add anything to that? Okay. Let's see. Should we anticipate instructions for the facilities and other resources documents based on the new review criteria?
So as we've said before, the application won't change. It's still the same information. If you're proposing this research, you should have, information on the biosketch, the expertise, and the resources. We're not requiring any changes, and reviewers won't be looking for anything different. It's just a little bit different on how it's assessed. So that's sort of the takeaway from that is we're making sure that community is aware of it. So, your summary statement will look different, as Mark pointed out, but your application itself there are no required changes.
Right. So you can, in terms of, facilities and resources, you can really make sure that you're targeting it toward the science that you're proposing, because now reviewers are just focusing on that, not your general kind of expertise, but what is needed for this project. So reading those review criteria hopefully will help you to write a better, more focused application, knowing what you're being evaluated on. But as we said many times, the actual structure of the application isn't changing.
So a question about the factors and the scoring for those factors. They're asking whether significance and innovation are each going to be scored 1 to 9, or is there one combined score?
It's just one combined score. So a little bit of history. So the working group recognized that innovation is a complex criteria in evaluating a proposal's importance or impact. So in some contexts, innovation, may be the focus and primary driver of the research of the importance of the research. And in other contexts, the application that's not very innovative may still be addressing a very important question and shouldn't be downgraded by a lack of innovation. And so the language in the new framework takes this into account. I think I'm trying to find the words. I think the exact language is evaluate the extent to which innovation influences the importance of undertaking the proposed research.
Thank you, Mark. Regarding the PI and institutional bias, should the PI consider reworking their personal statement on the biosketch or the role description in the budget justification, or should they continue to stress their expertise and experience?
I think Lisa answered that nicely before, in the sense that you probably want to tailor it to the research that you're proposing in that in the particular application that you're submitting.
And I think the application instructions already lead you in that direction.
Yeah.
So how does this have any effect, or does this have any effect on the calculation of percentiles or P-line?
So the percentile and P-line are determined by overall impact score and percentile, and they're still giving an overall impact score 1 to 9. So that will not change. Just sort of how they get to that number might be changed a little bit. So those won't change, but I know that CSR calculates the percentiles, and they will keep an eye on it. If there are any changes or major issues, they do have opportunities to reset it or address it. But we're not anticipating any changes, since the same overall impact score of 1 to 9 will still be used.
People have, are talking about this third factor, not surprisingly. Will there be further sub-criteria within the third factor to determine the gaps objectively?
Yeah, the blanket answers no. There's definitely, again, guidance in the language for evaluating that factor 3, but we're not going into sub-criteria because one of the things that we want to do is trust reviewers and recognize the very wide variety of both science and approaches and different ways of doing it, so that every time we try to make it more specific, there's exceptions, so we try to strike that balance of giving, reviewers guidance, but also letting them use their experience and the specific question, that application, in determining the evaluation of these factors. So we don't want to get more specific and then inadvertently end up, hurting one field that particular guidance doesn't apply to.
Yes, absolutely.
It also goes against the whole simplifying review criteria that we're trying to get to.
Has the new framework been piloted? And if not, why?
So this has also come up a few times. So we're not piloting this. So piloting that wouldn't change, designing a multi-year study with a subset of R01s or RPGs carved out for reviewing using this different set of criteria. And this would really result in uneven playing field across these applications over years. So again, logistically, we wouldn't want these two sets of R01s being reviewed different ways and then still having to be, having the second level of review make funding decisions for those. So it's much easier just to do implement the changes and make sure, we've allowed plenty of time for training and outreach to let everyone know about it. But that's why we're not doing a pilot.
Thank you. I know Mark mentioned in his slide some information about evaluation, but we do have a question here about how NIH is going to evaluate this change.
So again, we're going to be collecting information. Again, it's going to come from both SROs and leadership will be monitoring critiques and the discussions. We'll be looking at scoring and the demographics of success. We'll also be looking at reports of bias, whether they increase, decrease, and trying to think and also engaging with the applicant community. So we do this a lot. So one thing I guess that's maybe underappreciated by the community is how much effort we put into analyzing peer review on a round-to-round basis, a meeting-to-meeting basis. So we do a lot of it. We have an office for it. And so if there are any problems that creep in, we're able to address them rapidly.
Thank you. How will this affect the process or the criteria by which applications are separated into kind of discussed and not discussed by the review panel? Will there be any impact there?
So that's still determined by the preliminary overall scores from the assigned reviewers. And that's not changing. They're still submitting overall scores the same way they did before. And then when they come in, the not discussed preliminary list is based on that. And then at the end, the review committee still has final say on whether an application is discussed or not. So at the beginning of a meeting, they can rescue applications as it could before. But in short, that process will not change since the overall impact score process is still the same.
And then on a related note, will this new system have an impact on early stage investigator or new investigator applicants and what happens to them in peer review?
No, so that'll be the same. The instructions are when judging the investigator who's a new investigator or early stage investigator, we'll still be asking the reviewers to, when you're assessing them, to assess their training because their training, as opposed to whether or not they've had hundreds of papers published, because they probably haven't had the time to do that.
But again, hopefully by focusing on their accomplishments and the resources they gather to do their application, this will work toward kind of evening the playing field for people who are just starting out their career and have, the expertise and resources to do it without necessarily the track record. So we're hoping this actually improves their chances of receiving great impact scores.
Rating of peer reviewers on this is super important. How will this be structured? And can you share any information at this point in time?
You say grading?
I'm sorry, training of reviewers.
Training. Oh, okay. Great.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We definitely consider training a large part of our job. And, this is like kind of communication starting the training process, but the specifics are going to come. But definitely looking at multiple ways of training, developing things like a mock study section eventually to kind of show people how this is actually working out after we have some experience in these meetings. So yeah, there will be a lot of training resources, and you'll definitely watch the website and it'll start getting populated.
Right. And your SROs will certainly be reaching out, scientific review officers will be reaching out to reviewers and training. That's for sure.
And so Lisa's being a little modest because she's chairing the subcommittee. We have a whole subcommittee on training that's developing these materials, and lots of work ahead, but we anticipate them being ready by mid next year, late next year. Yeah.
How would this affect a resubmission under the new framework?
So a resubmission will be evaluated under the framework that is present for when it's submitted. So if it's after, for a NOFO after funding announcement after January 25th, 2025, then it will be evaluated under this simplified review framework. We will not just, and again, like I was saying, look at section 5, when you're applying, and you will see exactly how it's evaluated. So the resubmission, if it comes after the state, will be evaluated under the simplified review framework.
Will we be publishing our critique of this new system after 6 months or a year?
I've already talked to leadership about this, and yes, we'll be keeping the public informed about how this is going. I don't know it'll be 6 months out. It'll take some time for us to gather data to draw conclusions, but we will certainly, and as part of engaging with the applicant community.
All right, we have somebody out there who is an early career reviewer preparing to serve on their first review panel, and they're asking if they need to learn the old way of reviewing and scoring applications now and then the new simplified way later. The answer would be yes. And are there training materials still available to learn how applications are currently scored? Yep, because we have multiple review rounds before that happens. And so absolutely, there's lots out there, and your scientific review officer will be providing you the information that you need. Can strategies now be organized as 2 sections? 1, significance and innovation, and 2, approach. Past NIH communication encourages using 3 sections. Strategies now be organized. Is that, so I guess a research strategy? I guess they're talking about how they organize a research strategy of the application? Yeah. I guess, it's up to an applicant how they want to structure the application, right? You want to make sure that you're answering the questions that the reviewers are going to be evaluating against.
Yeah, and the way, as Mark pointed out, the way applications set up now, most all of them, you see significance, like heading for innovation, you have your specific aims, you go into your approach within the page limit, so those should look the same.
Will data management and sharing plan be evaluated differently with the new framework?
It's a trick question because we don't review doesn't affect those. So no, those will still be evaluated by program officers and the IC staff, they will not be evaluated by peer review.
Right, and that could be inspired by the question because we said resource sharing, right, is shifting. Right. Okay. Does this change the emphasis on productivity as an important criterion for renewal of RPGs, given the yes/no assessment of the PI?
So the evaluation of the renewal remains evaluate the progress made in the last funding period. So the productivity is still evaluated as part of the renewal criteria.
It looks like the budget will come under more scrutiny than it currently does. Is that correct?
No.
I don't know. I don't know why I would look that way. So, right, there's nothing changing there.
Right.
No.
Yeah, and the evaluation that doesn't affect the overall score. Yeah.
Good point. In the past, reviewers have been guided to note the significance of a prior and proposed research to help gauge significance, innovation, and approach. It sounds like reviewers will now be guided to note, should it be done, could it be done, rather than the rigor of prior and proposed research, or will the latter still be emphasized in review?
So the rigor of prior research, which is usually the foundational data that project is based on, is still an important component of review.
Yeah, if you look at the text in the guide notice for Section 5, under Factor 1, like it's still in there. If anything, it's emphasized more.
Yeah.
Does this new plan reduce the likelihood of having our resubmitted grants be reviewed by new reviewers instead of previous reviewers? Should it?
No. This is, slightly off topic, but we do look at resubmissions as a current application, although, responsiveness to prior critique can sometimes be factored in. The real emphasis is on the evaluation of the present application. And therefore, the expertise for that application is evaluated at the time of submission. So we don't have the identity of previous reviewers in our database so that we could use them. But just reminding you, sometimes that wouldn't even be appropriate, because if we're looking at the application fresh, the expertise may change because you have changed the application in response to the previous critique or just because of time. So we really do focus on each application when it comes in, and we don't keep the identity of previous reviewers.
And that's the policy now and will be in the future, right? So it's,
not changing.
I think. So how did or does the new simplified model consider or address issues of bias that affect foreign applications?
So those will be reviewed the same way. I don't think it'll affect it one way or the other. It's the same sort of level playing field for everyone. So they'll still have to have an extra section about resources going to a foreign university. Doesn't affect the score, and that'll actually be reviewed, not as part of peer review, but that'll be referred if an application is going to the council for that institute. So in short, it doesn't directly affect that. I mean, the changes will affect the application as a whole the way it does other ones, but it's not affecting review of applications for a foreign university.
And again, we're just focusing the reviewers on, the significance, impact, et cetera, of the application, not taking into consideration where it's coming from necessarily. If it's not a U.S. application.
So we're still working on scoring here. If Factor 3 has some weaknesses but is acceptable, will it affect the overall impact score? I think you've addressed this a couple times, but it's worth mentioning again.
Yeah. Question. And I'll just say on a different note, like there's no there's no mathematical formula for how a criterion or factor score goes into your overall impact score. We give the reviewers a lot of leeway on how they weigh them. And, as I think Lisa pointed out earlier, if there are identified gaps that are easily addressed, that would have less of an impact on the overall score, as opposed to things that just, cannot be addressed by the application. So there isn't a formula on how you determine it. Reviewers, we rely on them with their expertise in any field. There are too many caveats in every field to kind of give more specific instructions. So they are able to, those criteria will still affect the overall score, and they determine how much based on the significance of the strengths or weaknesses or the gaps that are identified.
So is this truly only impacting scoring?
Yeah, no. So again, we're changing how things are organized. We're changing the review definitions. Again, what we're expecting is the quality of the review will improve. Hopefully the output of this are content-rich critiques and summary statements that are focused on sort of those three key questions, of should it be done, can it be done, and will it be done? So we're hoping that this improves things, and it's not just something that's affecting scoring.
So from the applicant perspective, you're not changing your application in terms of how it's submitted and what's in your application. It's going to change just even how reviewers are conceptualizing the review, and it'll change how they're coming up with this score. But in the end, the impact score will still be 1 to 9, and you're still submitting your application in the same way.
Yeah, a lot of the focus, in the questions obviously has been on, the role of reputational bias and factor 3. But remember, the other reason we're doing this is burden on the reviewers. So less burden on them, more time to focus on the significance innovation approach, the overall impact, potential impact of the application. So there are two forces driving this. So we should keep both of them in mind. And I think could be a better quality review because they're not taking time to assess these administrative aspects.
Yeah, I think those are important points. On an early career reviewer, will it be possible to serve as an early career reviewer again under the new framework?
No.
Sorry.
We're ready to big time. We're ready to be a full reviewer. Sorry. You had your special attention. Now you're ready.
I would say that I wouldn't hesitate to accept, being an early career reviewer now if asked. There's lots of benefits to serving, and there's a lot of good things to take away from it. And even though it won't prepare you for the new simplifying review framework, it's still a good idea to serve.
Yeah, great. Since resubmissions are basically considered new applications, are there plans to eliminate the introduction section?
So you still had, when you submit, you still had the option of submitting it as new or as a resubmission. But as of now, this project itself that we're working on, it is not addressing that topic at all. They still will allow, a one resubmission for an application. You'll still have the introduction, and reviewers will still have access to the previous summary statement. So that won't be affected by this project.
Okay. So if a proposal had high significance but low innovation, would those two subfactors be averaged for factor 1? Or if one subfactor is rated as high, is factor 1 rated as high? So I think there's a little bit of confusion because there's only one score for factor 1, right? There's not two separate scores for factor 1. But do you want to talk about significance and innovation and how a reviewer might think about that as it relates to factor 1 when coming up with a score?
So I think I addressed this in my answer earlier. This was made up. So yes, so it's just one score, and it's to take into account, sometimes innovation is dry. Remember, the factor is the importance of the research. It's not significance, right? It's the importance of the research. And so in some cases, innovation is really driving that. If you're making a new tool that can be distributed broadly to answer new questions, that might be driving the score for the importance of the research. Other times, you may have a research question, that's very, very important, but low innovation in terms of how you're going to get it done. Again, the working group didn't want them to those types of applications to be downgraded. So, and that language is in the description for that factor.
Thank you.
So I guess I should say it like this. Maybe this will get the answer. It's an integrative type of review, right? We're not taking one and the other and then trying to mesh them together and average them when we're coming up with a great factor score for them.
All right. Last question. And I think we've touched it, but it's a good drive home question. Is there a single key takeaway emphasis that should be relayed to PIs and future applicants? The short, elevator ride speech is what they're looking for. What do they need to know?
I think Lisa said it earlier. I would say for any notice of funding opportunity or NOFO you're applying for, look at Section 5. You should always do this because that is what the reviewers are going to use to guide their review. So whether it's the current version or new version, I would say always look at that because you'll know what the reviewers, what they'll be addressing.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that if you are a potential applicant that's been concerned that you're not from a big name school or you don't have the track record, that maybe now's the time to think about applying, right?
That's a good point.
Okay, so thank you all, panelists, for your answers, and thank you to our audience for their questions and for the engagement. We're going to be using the questions that we received today to continue to flesh out the FAQs that are on the Simplified Review website. We have quite a number there already that you're welcome to take advantage of. We'll be developing a plethora of resources to support the community in the next year for this change. And we'll be having additional events like this webinar to answer additional questions. So thank you for joining us today. We'll make the recording available on the event webpage as soon as we can. You'll see the URL for our website right here on this slide. And, if you have questions that have gone unanswered, certainly you can reach out to us at simplifiedreview@nih.gov. And thank you.